Hi, I'm Ethan from Central Computers. Today we'll be taking a close look at some of the new X870 chipset motherboards for the AM5 platform that are releasing this weekend. Asus was kind enough to send out review samples of their Tough Gaming X870 Plus Wi-Fi motherboard and ROG Crosshair X870 Hero motherboard, both of which will be available at all 5 of our stores on September 29th, which is launch day. The first motherboard we'll be looking at is the Tough Gaming X870 Plus Wi-Fi. You can see that the box design hasn't deviated much from its predecessor, and opening it up here we have the motherboard itself, which we'll get to in just a moment, we have our manual, and also some accessories. As usual, you've got your Tough Gaming sticker, which I love because when I'm at the store I like to stick these on the employees' backs when they're not paying attention, and then you also have some M.2 screws and some SATA cables as well as your Wi-Fi antenna. By the way, if you guys think this custom desk mat is cool, we do sell it on our website for $22. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, buying one of those is one of the best ways to support us. Now moving forward, let's take a look at the motherboard itself. The first thing that stands out to me is the Tough branding on both the VRM and chipset heatsinks. When I first saw pictures of this motherboard, I thought that the Tough lettering was just printed on, but this decoration is actually 3-dimensional. Going over the general features that this motherboard has to offer, to begin with, it uses a 16+2+1 power stage design with alloy chokes and an 8-layer PCB. You could definitely squeeze in a good amount of overclocking here. Both this motherboard and the Crosshair X870E have support for Asus's plethora of overclocking features, including but not limited to their AI overclocking profiles, dynamic OC switcher, core flex, asynchronous clock, and PBO enhancement. This board will also support the recently released Ryzen 9000 series processors out of the box, so if you're a new buyer on the market, you won't need to worry about doing a BIOS update anytime soon. And speaking of new buyers, if you don't have much experience with building computers, this motherboard does have a lot of DIY friendly features that we think are worth mentioning. I'm going to go ahead and remove the M.2 heatsink here to show off these M.2 quick release latches that allow you to quickly secure and unsecure your M.2 drives. With the exception of having to unscrew the aluminum heatsink, it's completely toolless. And by the way, with this motherboard, you do have 4 total M.2 slots, with the top 2 being PCIe Gen 5 and the bottom 2 being PCIe Gen 4. Additionally, your top PCIe slot is going to be Gen 5 and the bottom one is Gen 4. Sticking to the theme of DIY friendly features, we've got a set of debug LEDs on the right side of the motherboard that allow you to diagnose any potential issues with your system. And something that we found very interesting is this long plastic piece that extends out of the PCIe latch that allows you to unlatch the PCIe slot and remove your graphics card without having to cram your fingers between your CPU cooler and your GPU shroud. I love seeing features like this because all it does is just make PC building more accessible to more and more people. Now going over the connectors, we're going to start in the top left corner here and work our way around the board. You have a set of 2 8-pin EPS power connectors, which are Asus ProCool connectors with pins inside, meaning that they're built to ensure that your PSU power cables are making full contact to avoid any potential connectivity issues. Then towards the top right, you have a group of 4-pin PWM headers, an I/O pump header, a CPU fan header, and an additional optional CPU fan header. Right below the debug lights is a 3-pin ARGB header, followed by the 24-pin ATX power connector. Then, there's the front panel USB Type-C header, which can do 20 gigabits per second, paired with a 5 gigabit per second USB 3 header. There's 2 right-angle SATA connectors here, and then moving towards the bottom edge of the board, we have your front panel connectors, a 2-pin chassis intrusion header, a 4-pin PWM pump header for a liquid-cooled system, 2 USB 2 headers, a 2-pin thermal sensor header, 2 additional 3-pin ARGB headers, a serial port connector followed by a group of 3 PWM 4-pin chassis fan headers, and finally the HD audio front panel connector. This motherboard has a ton of ARGB and PWM connectors, and personally I do like the placement of them. I think if I were to use this motherboard in something like an O11 dynamic case with the fan slots maxed out, I would definitely have a very easy time doing so. There's a total of 4 chassis fan headers if you include the stray one by the M.2 slot here, along with 2 CPU fan headers and 2 pump headers. Lastly, taking a look at the side of the motherboard here, we can go over the I/O panel. Starting off here is a 2.5 gig Realtek Ethernet LAN port on top of 2 USB ports running at 10 gigabits per second, an HDMI out, and then you've also got a USB 2.0 here that says BIOS next to it. So this is the USB port you would want to use if you want to do a BIOS update with a flash drive. Next to it is another 10 gigabit per second USB port, and under both of these is a set of 2 USB Type-C Gen 4 ports. Both of them are 40 gigabits per second and support DisplayPort standard, so you can use these for video out if you wanted to. Then there's this big stack of 5 gigabit per second USB ports, your Wi-Fi module, and your audio jacks, including an SPDIF port. By the way, this motherboard does feature Wi-Fi 7, so if you're looking for an excuse to upgrade your home network to Wi-Fi 7, this is a good one. It's also got onboard Bluetooth. Overall, this motherboard is a very good option for anyone that is currently running an older platform and wants to upgrade to the latest generation. The hardware is more than sufficient for any of the 9000 series processors, even up to a 9950X, and it's got a good mix of newcomer-friendly and enthusiast-oriented features, cementing it as a solid purchase in our book. As mentioned previously, Asus sent us not only the Tough Gaming X870 Plus Wi-Fi motherboard, but also its higher-end sibling, the ROG Crosshair X870 Hero, which we'll be taking a look at next. Opening up the box, you have the motherboard itself, and let me tell you, this thing is heavy. It's probably all the aluminum heatsinks that are packed onto this thing, but just holding it in my hand, I can feel the weight. Putting that aside, they actually printed a little guide for some of the motherboard features. Looks like they're kind of describing how the M.2 quick release latch works and a couple of other things. Then you've got a ROG sticker sheet along with the user manual, and then the collectible card. Underneath the cardboard insert on the left side of the box is where all the important accessories are jam-packed. Now the most important of these accessories is of course the ROG bottle opener. This bottle opener is only for those who dare, so make sure you're handling it accordingly. Truly the pinnacle of gaming hardware. Then you've got the Wi-Fi antennas, a USB flash drive with drivers pre-installed, which I think is extremely helpful, some SATA cables, and then an RGB extension cable. There's also some M.2 screws, a couple little rubber pieces scattered around here, and that's pretty much it for the box. Now, taking a look at the motherboard itself, this thing is an absolute monster of an AM5 board. On top of the huge VRM heatsink, it's got an adjustable RGB Republic of Gamers logo with the word Crosshair printed next to it, and this huge ROG logo on the M.2 and chipset heatsink. I think this design approach of having heatsinks cover a majority of the PCB is always super clean. You can even see the back of the motherboard here is also covered in metal backplates. It definitely does a good job at selling the flagship vibe. The Crosshair X870E Hero features 18+2+2 power stages and a dual chipset design compared to the 16+2+1 on the TUF gaming board. The caps are all metal, and as we previously pointed out, you get a big ol' aluminum heatsink for your VRMs with an L-shaped heat pipe underneath. Similar to the TUF X870, you have the same quick release toolless design on the M.2 slots. This particular top slot here has this comically heavy aluminum heatsink, and compared to the TUF board, you don't need to unscrew anything. Clip it out and clip it back on. So in total, you have 5 NVMe M.2 slots. This top slot here and the two under the heatsink can do PCIe Gen 5, while the bottom two are running Gen 4. Unlike the TUF gaming board, both the main PCIe slot and the bottom PCIe slot have received the PCIe Gen 5 treatment. Something interesting is that the latch on the PCIe slots has a retention system. You'll see as I lock and unlock it, there's some kickback here. It's a really neat feature and should presumably help with the heavy graphics cards that you see a lot in today's market. Now onto the connectors. Starting at the top left corner here is your two 8-pin EPS connectors sharing the same Asus ProCool design as its TUF gaming sibling. Then you have a cluster of 4 PWM headers here bearing an optional CPU fan header, your main CPU fan header, an AIO pump header, and a chassis fan header. This is right next to the debug LED here that is able to display error codes, a feature you'll find on any high-end enthusiast-oriented board that is super useful for diagnosis. Then you have an ARGB header followed by a start button, flex key, and reset button. Moving down, you have the 24-pin ATX connector, and interestingly, there's an additional 8-pin connector. Now on the X870E boards, they had the same additional 8-pin connector and it was used for USB-C power delivery, so we assume it serves the same function here. Then you've got your first 20 gigabit per second USB-C header, and stay tuned because it's not the only one, and another chassis fan header right beneath it. Going further down, we have your 4 6 gigabit per second right angle SATA connectors, and fascinatingly, a slim SAS connector that supports PCIe Gen 4 speeds. Right next to that is a right angle front panel USB header, which is a little quirky, and at the very bottom right corner of the motherboard here, there's a header for LN2 mode for extreme overclocking. You got your CMOS battery, and your second 20 gigabit per second USB-C front panel connector, and also the second USB 3 header. Unfortunately, it's not right angle like the other one. And then you've got 2 USB 2 headers, 2 ARGB headers, and going further is a 2-pin chassis intrusion header, a PWM pump header, another chassis fan header, and your front panel audio. Moving on to the rear I/O, this board is absolutely stacked. At the top left, you have a clear CMOS button, which is very handy for troubleshooting, right on top of your BIOS flashback button. This motherboard boasts 4 USB-C ports total, 2 of which are USB 4 running at 40 gigabits per second, and the other 2 at 10 gigabit per second. Additionally, all 6 of the red USB Type A ports you see here are all 10 gigabit per second. There's even 2 LAN ports, the left one supporting 5 gigabit per second, and the right supporting 2.5 gigabit per second. Then you've got your Wi-Fi module, which also supports Wi-Fi 7 similar to the TUF board, your audio ports, and your optical audio out. This motherboard is packed to the brim with enthusiast-oriented features, so if you're planning to buy any of the Ryzen 9 CPUs from the latest generation and push them to their limits, this is the motherboard that you need to be looking out for. We hope you enjoyed this overview of Asus's new X870 boards, and if you're interested in purchasing one, they will be available for purchase on September 29th, which is this upcoming weekend, on our website linked below. We have 5 stores in the California Bay Area, so if you're local, you can even pick one up in our physical stores. The staff members here are really kind and knowledgeable, so definitely don't miss out on that if you have the option, and we would also like to extend our thanks to Asus today for providing the motherboards to review. Happy building!